Welcome to today's deep dive. Um, we asked you to send us some interesting research, and you definitely delivered. This one's about a potential link between school lunches and standardized tests.
Yeah, it's pretty wild, right?
It is. So this is an NBER working paper called Food for Thought: The Effects of School Accountability Plans on School Nutrition.
Right, and it basically looks at whether some schools might be using, maybe a slightly concerning strategy to boost student performance.
So to set the scene, the study focuses on elementary schools in Virginia back in 2000.
Hmm.
Virginia had this high-stakes testing system where schools could actually face penalties if they didn't meet certain standards.
Exactly. And the researchers really zeroed in on the students who were eligible for free or reduced price lunches.
Ah, okay.
That's the population that's often most affected by these accountability measures.
No, I think a lot of people might be wondering, like, what on earth does school lunch have to do with test scores?
Right.
And that's where this research gets really interesting. Schools have a surprising amount of control over their lunch menus.
Yeah.
They can pretty easily adjust the nutritional content of what they're serving.
And what's really fascinating here is that it's actually the USDA that oversees school lunch programs, not the educational authorities.
Huh.
So you've got this kind of interesting situation where schools could potentially use this program to their advantage.
So the study authors talk about all this existing research on the connection between nutrition and cognitive function, right?
Yeah, there's a growing body of evidence.
Right, and especially when it comes to glucose.
Exactly. What we eat can really impact how well we think, at least in the short term.
Makes sense. And I mean, think about all those empty calories.
Oh, yeah.
You get that quick burst of energy, but then...
And the study actually cites research specifically looking at how those empty calories affect cognitive performance.
Interesting. Okay, so here's the big finding. Schools that had at least one failing school, meaning they were at risk of those state sanctions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Those schools significantly increased the calorie content of their lunches during testing weeks.
We're not talking about a small increase either.
Like just a few extra crackers.
No. Schools that were feeling the pressure from these accountability measures increased average calorie content by a whopping 17% during those testing weeks compared to non-testing weeks.
Wow, 17%?
Yeah.
That's a pretty big jump. Meanwhile, schools that weren't under the same pressure to improve test scores didn't change their menus much at all.
Right.
Their calorie count stayed pretty consistent throughout the year. So it really makes you wonder if those threatened schools were trying to give their students a little extra boost before those big tests.
It's definitely possible.
Yeah.
And to make sure they weren't just seeing some kind of random signal change, the researchers looked for similar calorie fluctuations during other 3-week periods in their data.
Smart.
And
Well, they only found this pattern during the actual testing weeks.
pretty telling, right?
It is. But here's where it gets even more interesting. While calories were going up in those threatened schools during testing weeks, other important nutrients, like vitamin C and protein, were actually going down.
Yeah, it's like they were prioritizing short-term cognitive gains over a more balanced nutritional approach. Makes you wonder about their motivations a little, right?
It does, yeah.
Yeah.
Like, were they so focused on meeting those accountability standards that they weren't thinking about the long-term health implications?
Possibly, yeah. And I mean, it raises some pretty big ethical questions about these high-stakes testing systems.
For sure.
Imagine if you found out your kid's school was doing this.
Yeah. Not sure I'd be thrilled about that. But okay, so this study was relatively small,
Mm-hmm.
but the researchers did find some evidence suggesting that the schools with the bigger calorie increases during testing also saw bigger jumps in student pass rates, especially in math.
That's a really important point. It's tough to say for sure if those extra calories directly cause the higher test scores, but the correlation is definitely interesting. It makes you wonder if some of those test score improvements that people attribute to these accountability systems might actually be due to something as simple as school lunch.
It's like this hidden factor, And if schools are tweaking lunch menus to influence test scores, how can we really say those scores are an accurate measure of student achievement?
Yeah, that's a big question. Are we really measuring actual learning or just the temporary bump in performance because of a bunch of extra calories?
Exactly. And what are the long-term consequences for student health?
Right.
If schools are doing this regularly, could it contribute to things like unhealthy eating habits or even childhood obesity?
Those are valid concerns for sure. I think this study really highlights the importance of thinking beyond those short-term gains.
Mm-hmm.
We have to consider the potential unintended consequences of policies like these high-stakes testing systems.
Totally. It's like a reminder that even when these accountability systems start with good intentions, they can sometimes lead to some pretty unexpected and potentially harmful outcomes.
Definitely. We need to be looking at the big picture here. It highlights the need for a more holistic approach when we're evaluating these systems. We can't just focus on the intended outcomes. We need to carefully consider the potential downsides as well.
Wow, this deep dive has really gotten me thinking differently about education policy and assessments.
It really shows how even things that seem totally unrelated, like what's on the school lunch menu, can end up affecting how we measure educational success.
Yeah, we started off asking what's the connection between school lunches and standardized test scores.
Right.
But as we've been going through this research, it's become clear that there are so many bigger issues at play here.
Absolutely, like these accountability systems and the unintended consequences they can have,
Right.
and the ethics of trying to measure something as complex as student learning.
It's a good reminder that there's always more to the story than we might think at first. We need to dig deeper and look at all the different angles.
Exactly. And next time you hear about standardized test scores or some new education reform, think back to this deep dive. Yeah,
And remember that surprising connection to school lunches? You might start to question some of the assumptions people are making and see those hidden connections.
for sure. Well, if this deep dive left you wanting more, make sure to click like and subscribe to this Unlock Your Mind podcast.
We'll keep bringing you these fascinating insights from the world of research.